everybody. So today we are going to be discussing the basics of lighting your miniatures. There's a lot when it comes to soldering and switches and all that that is a little bit more in depth. If it's something you want me to get into, let me know in the comments. Let me know through Instagram, and I can go into that a little bit further. But let's just get started. So I'm going to start with just letting you guys know what I use. You don't necessarily need all these tools, but they are helpful to have. So we'll start with one of these. This is a wire stripper. I like this style just because it works well on very small gauge wires, which is typically what we use in miniatures, and it's very quick. So I will show you how this works right now. I'm just going to grab a piece of wire here. So typically you have, this is what I use. It's red and black wire like that. And you can, I buy these in sort of like a pair like this. You can also buy them separately. Doesn't really matter. So you would split them like this, and then you would cut the ends, and it gives you a nice tip to solder to your light, to your switch, all that stuff. So this, super important. Scissors to cut your wire. You can also use like some small snips, doesn't really matter. A heat gun for your heat shrink. Heat shrink is a product that will keep your wires together. So once you make the connection, this goes on and it will shrink around your connection and make it super tight. So this one's not shrinking all that much just because I chose a larger size and it's also only one wire. Typically you would have two in there and tighten that up. So little heat gun for that. This is specifically made for soldering. A blow dryer will not be hot enough, and a lighter could work at a distance, but tends to be a little too hot and may melt your wire. These are called helping hands, especially if you work alone like most of us do. This will hold wire A, and then you can use the other to hold wire B. Let's get that in there. I'm trying to work looking through the camera. So you would line those up like that, and then you would solder your connection. Okay, so helping hands, very useful. Again, not necessary, very useful. Then you have your solder. I like to use this one here. Kind of comes out this way. It's just easier for me to hold, almost like a pencil. And then you have, of course, your soldering iron, which can either be a standalone tool or it can be a soldering station like this. Same thing, does the same job. Not one's better than the other. Typically, the solder stations just have your built-in sponge and cleaner, or you can have a tip cleaner, which is separate like this one, and you just put it in there and get the solder off. And then you have some soldering paste. So I only use this, I mean, with the wires I use, I usually don't need this, but if I see that the solder isn't sticking to the wire, it's either because the wire is dirty or maybe there's too much solder on my soldering iron. So I just put a little bit of this on the wire or on the tip of the soldering iron, and that'll fix that up. Now, those are the tools you need. Here's some example of wire. So this is the one that I buy separately. So I'll make sure all this stuff is linked in my Amazon store below. You can go check that out. Everything I use is listed in there, so you can either purchase directly what I use or find something similar. So let's talk about LEDs and different types of LEDs. So you have your typical, what I call the diode. Oh, sorry about that. So just the regular LED. I bought these off Amazon. These are pre-wired LEDs. Just makes things a little bit easier. This one specifically is bright white, but you can get them in warm white and colors and all that. These are 9 volt. I typically don't use these anymore, and I'll explain why in a second. Um, these are chip LEDs. Get those in focus for you. So these can come in square, round, different ways. The reason I like these is if you drill a hole big enough, they kind of, I don't know if you can see there, they kind of have a little glass dome over them. So a lot of times I'll drill a hole in the ceiling of wherever I'm using these and put them in from the other side, and it's sort of your light is already done. It's already, in a little glass dome and everything. So I really like these. Plus they're super bright. They can go up to 5 volts, but can be powered with 3 volts. And again, I'll come back to that in a second in terms of voltage. Then you have these here. I don't know if the camera's going to be able to focus on this. These are called nano LEDs. These are pretty much as small as it gets. You can get these in any color and all that, and these are 3 volts. They have pre-wired with resistors in them. And then, as some of you have seen in some of my other projects, these are filament LEDs. So what these are basically are, if you've ever bought a modern Edison bulb, an LED Edison bulb, usually inside this will kind of be twisted up in there to sort of mimic an old style filament. And what they've started to do is actually sell these bare wire. They're a little bit tricky to find, but I do have links in my Amazon store for you guys. Again, multiple colors, multiple lengths. This is probably the longest that I have. And these are 3 volt as well. And then we have switches. Now, switches is an entirely different ball game. I'm not going to get into switches today just because there are different types of switches. And different types of switches connect in different type of ways. So some of them, have like a 3-way switch, which the middle does something and the other way is off, the other way is on. But typically, whatever switches you buy will usually tell you what kind of switches they are. And it's just a question of finding, positive, negative. You can test it out before soldering. It's pretty simple if you just get a 2-way switch like this one that has just positive, negative. And that's it. And if you just Google switch diagram and find one that has a switch that looks like yours, that's the easiest trick. That's how I learned how to do it. I'm by far not an electrician. These are the most common switches that I use. However, I also use whenever I have clients that want a battery pack. I typically use something like this. So this has a switch built in, and this one in particular will hold 3 AAAs. I also have a bunch that hold 2 AA's, and I have some that hold 9 volt if needed. These work great. I like that the switch is built in. I like that it's pre-wired. What I don't like about these, and I've researched this to hell and back, so if any of you find anything like what I'm about to explain, please let me know. The issue with these is the switch is on this side. The battery compartment opens on this side. So you can't really glue this anywhere. This is the issue I have with these is, you want the switch exposed for your client or yourself to turn it on and off. However, if the battery dies and you've glued this to your piece, you can now no longer change the batteries. So usually what I do, the only solution I found, sorry about that. The only solution I found so far is I will do some heavy duty double stick Velcro on this. So when the battery dies, the client or yourself, you can take this off the piece, leave a little slack in the wire. They can turn it, open it, switch the wires, Velcro it back. Usually this is in the back, so it's not really an issue. I have been able to find these. Much harder to find. I had to buy these in bulk from Asia. These are flush mount, so you have to make sure there's room in your piece to cut this section out, and then this goes in, 4 screws. Batteries are accessible, and there's a switch. I've only found these for 9 volt and 2 AA's, but that covers me most of the time. I've used these a couple of times. It looks super professional when your stuff is done. And if any of you have seen my movie theater build, this one was actually on the roof, and I used an HVAC unit glued to the battery lid to sort of hide the battery pack, just so the client didn't want the switch in the back, just because it was going to be on a shelf. So it's like this in the piece, and they can just turn it on and off, take off the HVAC unit to charge the batteries. Now, that's the sort of the tools and the LEDs themselves. When it comes to actually wiring and soldering and all that, the first thing I want to mention is the sort of do's and don'ts. Do not just twist the wires and use electrical tape. I guarantee you, within a year, your connection will fail, something will go wrong. It's not worth the risk to do that. Especially in my case, a lot of my wiring ends up being buried inside the piece and not accessible once it's finished. Usually, I make sure the battery area and switch area are somewhat accessible, but the internal wiring, some of my pieces have pretty complex wiring, and that's not accessible once it's wired up. So you do want to solder. Now, what if you don't want to buy the helping hands and the soldering station and the hot air gun and the shrink tube, this stuff? Well, there's a new product. I actually learned about this through Adam Savage. These are called solder seal connectors. They are pretty cheap. You can get them in a bunch of different sizes. This is one I bought recently in bulk just because I use this size a lot. You can get a mixed container which has a bunch of different sizes, but I found that I rarely use these, and I was all out of the white ones. So I was able to find just the white ones. So the way these work, and I'll show you in a second, the way these work is the clear part is standard shrink tube. So it's what I showed you before. In the center, you have some solder just sitting there. And then the 2 white things are rings that will also shrink with the heat, but they provide waterproofing for your connection. So let me show you really quick how that works. It's very simple. So I'm going to use my helping hands here, but you don't have to. So you take one of your connections. Now, typically you would not be connecting a red and a black wire together. This is just an example. Put the other one there, and you want to make sure that they're touching inside where the solder is. So I'm going to pop these in my helping hands. And this is where, you can use your heat gun, you can use a lighter, and we're just going to heat that up. I'm going to try not to keep it in one spot, but you also want to make sure that the solder melts. And there it goes. Solder is melted. All done. That quick. That quick, my friends. Look at that. Beautiful connection. Wires are touching metal. The solder, still a bit warm. This is a waterproof connection. I will not pull at this because it's still a bit warm, but in a couple of seconds, yeah, there you go. This will not come apart. This will last forever. Okay? This is the way to go if you don't want to invest in all of this. Very cheap, very affordable, and it's just as good, if not better, because this also adds waterproofing. Okay? Now, let's say you don't want to use those for whatever reason. I will show you how to solder. So we will use, for an example, this 9 volt to a 9 volt connector. So before I was saying I don't use these very much. Why don't you use them, David? Well, I've had and this is a me problem, but maybe some of you can share in this. I often will, with everything going on in a build, sort of forget and not pay attention to the voltage of something or whatever. And it's happened to me before where I'll put a 9-volt light in a build and the wires are not accessible and the light is glued in and everything's done. And I plug it to my power source and my power source is 12-volt. Guess what happens to the bulb? Burns out. Have to take my build apart, have to rip everything apart just to replace that light bulb to connect it to the proper voltage. So what I've done is I still have remnants of stuff at different voltages, but anything I've bought in the last year has been 3 volts. I try and stick to 3 volts. It's the most common. These are 3 volts. The nanos are 3 volts. These are 5, but work at 3. It just makes it easier. I stick to the same voltage. I know everything is going to work. I know nothing's going to blow up and everything's good. So, but for the example, I will use this 9-volt to this 9-volt connector. And obviously, in real life, you may want a switch in between this. So we're going to do red with red. Sorry about that. I'm going to get some heat shrink. So the trick with heat shrink is you want to make sure that you put it on before you make your connection. I know it's obvious, but I've made the mistake. And once your connection is soldered, you cannot make the connection again. I'm going to try and zoom in here. There we go. Okay. So you want to get them just when they're touching. We're going to start heating up the soldering iron. Now I'm going to try and do this without blocking the camera for you guys. So I just turned the soldering iron on. Let's see if it's hot yet. Also, the other method, the other product I showed you, where you just have to heat it up, is also much safer. It's very easy to get burned with a soldering iron. So there we go. There. So those are soldered together. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my heat shrink. I'm going to slide it right over that connection. And I'm going to heat it up. There we go. Nice connection there. Now we can do our black one. Same thing. Grab our solder. That connection's done. Slide that over. And there you go. Okay, and then we're going to put our battery back, and our light should light up. There you go. Now, one last thing I will show you guys is I have a power adapter that has a knob on it that you can sort of regulate the voltage. It goes from 3 all the way to 12. And I use this with these things here. And I use this to test my connections. So this is what I'm using before the switch is installed, before my wiring is all the way through. You want to make sure everything is working, and I do this constantly throughout my build, especially right before and right after I glue something in. So then we have the nano LED. So we plug the positive, plug the negative, and we can see tiny little light. And I have that in a bunch of colors. I use those a lot. And of course, everyone's favorite, the filament LEDs. The trick with these is knowing which is negative, which is positive. So I don't know if you can see on camera here. See that tiny little hole in the end? That's how you know it's positive. So that means that it's red. And that means that this is the negative. And look at that. How cool is that? These are some of the coolest lights I worked with. In person, it's super like fluorescent green. On camera, it comes off very white, but it's very green. All right, guys. So that is the basics of lighting. Again, it's a very vast thing. Lighting is its own, the same way I can do an entire video on glue, I can do an entire other video on switches, another entire video on, how do you fish your wires, hide the wires in your build. But this is a good basic start. I hope it helps you guys out. Please leave comments below or hit me up on Instagram if there's anything else you feel I missed that you want to know. I hope you enjoyed this video. More to come. Thank you all for supporting this new tutorials thing that I'm trying to do. And have a good one.